The never-ending coronavirus crisis. The never-ending emergency crisis of COVID-19. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. Emergency use authorization. That's how this whole vaccination craze took effect regarding COVID-19, regarding the coronavirus shots. Have you ever wondered when that emergency use authorization came into effect? So I'll give you the history of that. And guess what? It ties back to George W. Bush during his White House administration. Very interesting. Before I get into that, though, I want to give a quick heads up that if you enjoy listening to Bold and Blunt, why not subscribe? Why not subscribe to my 3 times a week newsletter? It comes out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at the Washington Times, which contains all my commentaries that I write at the Washington Times, as well as my twice weekly Bold and Blunt podcasts that come out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You can go to WashingtonTimes.com, scroll down to the bottom of the page, find the newsletter section, and sign up there. I'd love to have you aboard. I'd love to have your support. And you can also get Bold and Blunt at the #1 platform online for Christian and faith-based podcasts. It's called edify.app/podcasts. Go there. You can sign up for Bold and Blunt there and check out all the other faith-based podcasts as well. And once again, you can always find Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are offered. Emergency use authorization. We have heard that phrase thrown around quite a bit in the last couple of years, haven't we? Because those were the conditions under which the coronavirus vaccines came about. And those are the conditions under which Joe Biden and his White House administration get by with making the case for vaccine mandates on pretty much every American citizen, supposedly free American citizen. But how many of you guys out there know the source of emergency use authorizations? Well, that came from the Project Bioshield Act of 2004, signed into law by President George W. Bush. Contained in that provision was an authorization for the head of the FDA commissioner, to issue emergency use authorizations to, and this is from the FDA's website, Food and Drug Administration's government website, to, quote, authorize the use of unapproved medical products or unapproved uses of approved medical products during CBRN emergencies. What are CBRN emergencies? Well, CBRN, one of the government's very, very, very many acronyms, stands for chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear. So when there are perceived chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear emergencies, the FDA commissioner under this 2004 Act has the authority to issue emergency use authorizations. So that is the genesis of these EUAs. And since 2004, these emergency use authorizations were further strengthened. The government says clarified, but they were also expanded and extended by various other acts. In 2006, for instance, there was an act passed authorizing the establishment of what's called BARDA, B-A-R-D-A, within Health and Human Services. What's BARDA? Again, with the government acronyms. That stands for Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. So that's sort of the clearinghouse to develop what the government deems as necessary vaccines. Vaccines that are necessary for the national security of American citizens, for instance, in case we're ever attacked by a chemical agent. the government will have on hand a stockpile of vaccines that can save us from this biochemical attack. That's the logic anyhow. So let me give you a quick rundown on what the federal government has been doing busily since September 11th, 2001, in order to develop vaccines that supposedly will save American citizens from some sort of chemical attack. There was, in 2002, the Bioterrorism Act, the Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act of 2002. Then came Project Bioshield, the Act of 2004, which is where these emergency use authorization provisions come from. This is where the FDA gets the power to claim a vaccine development is necessary that can bypass the normal vaccine approval process. You know, the normal vaccine approval process in this country takes years. It takes years because you have to go through these very specific steps to determine the long-term safety of the vaccine, of the vaccination on American citizens. Emergency use authorization bypasses that long-term study, even as medical bureaucrats in the federal government will tell us nothing to see here, nothing to worry about with these coronavirus vaccines, that they're sure that they're safe for long-term use, that they're sure there will be no long-term repercussions. The fact is they can't exactly claim that because the very nature of emergency use authorization issuances allows the bypass of those long-term, in-depth studies. That's where we get a lot of the issues that crop that don't appear during the short-term use. Anyhow, Project Bioshield Act of 2004, that's where emergency use authorizations sprang from. After that, several federal actions strengthened the right of the federal government to issue what the federal government deems as necessary to save American citizens from chemical attacks, from CBRNs, from chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear attacks. Some of those include the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act of 2005, the PrEP Act, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act of 2006, the PAHPA Act, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act of 2013, the PAHPRA Act, the 21st Century Cures Act of 2016, Public Law 115-92 of 2017, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness and Advancing Innovation Act of 2019, the PAHPAIA Act, and finally, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act of 2020. And that may be a little dull to listen to all those titles, but I want to give you the specific titles so if you want to look up for yourself, you know the exact words to type into Google or type into Bing or wherever and look it up yourself. But emergency use authorization, this is what President Bush said about the Bioshield Act that he signed into law. The bill I am about to sign is an important element in our response to the September 11th, 2001 attacks. By authorizing unprecedented funding and providing new capabilities, Project Bioshield will help America purchase, develop, and deploy cutting-edge defenses against catastrophic attack. Look, and guess whose name was tied to pushing and supporting the idea of more funding for development of vaccines in this country way back in 2003, 2004. Anthony S. Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, he said that this Bioshield, Project Bioshield, should remedy past, quote, difficulty to get companies engaged due to the lack of a guaranteed market, end quote, for new therapies and preventive vaccines. See, the thing is, a lot of private companies, medical companies, pharmaceutical companies, don't like to pursue new development of vaccines, of medical therapies that are injected, because it's a very lengthy research and development process that can prove very costly for something that in the end may never be A, approved, and or B, result in a revenue stream for that company. Big Pharma knows that vaccines are kind of an iffy development project to pursue. They may never recoup all the money and time that they had to spend during the research and development stage, the very lengthy research and development stage that we have in this country. The permitting stage, the permitting and approval process is time consuming, and Big Pharma knows that in the end, it may not be worthwhile. So President Bush, I'm reading from a Wall Street Journal article now, dated January 30th, 2003, President Bush in unveiling Project Bioshield, a $6 billion initiative to finance new drugs and vaccines for combating bioweapons, offered companies an incentive to develop life-saving products that was short on details but long on hope. Two top federal health officials cautioned after Mr. Bush's State of the Union speech unveiling Project Bioshield, that the new funding and procurement authority may require action by Congress before being implemented. This is when Fauci stepped in and said that this is a good deal because now companies have a guaranteed taxpayer-funded funding stream to pursue vaccine development without having to take on all the risk and cost that goes along with private market development. So Project Bioshield, what it did, as this Wall Street Journal laid out, was first establish a system of secure taxpayer dollars being used to pursue vaccines, for government bureaucrats to pursue vaccines. It initially guaranteed $6 billion over 10 years for federal researchers to develop vaccines against smallpox and anthrax. And of course, it opened the door for more funds to be added to this pot as needed. Second, Project Bioshield gave to NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which Anthony Fauci oversees, right? Along with partnering institutes within the National Institutes of Health, it gave them the authority to speed through the processing of grant funds for organizations to develop, to research and develop new vaccines that help with America's safety and security for CBRN attacks, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear attacks. And third, it gave the FDA commissioner a new authority to approve use of these vaccines and drugs and what's called MCMs, medical countermeasures. There's the government's love of acronyms again. It gave the new authority for the FDA commissioner to use these, to approve these under emergency use authorization. So this is where all this emergency use authorization speedy implementation of COVID-19 tied vaccines and their boosters comes from. George W. Bush, tailing off the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks on America's soil, justified opening the door for federal medical bureaucrats to speed through development and approved use of vaccines for American citizens based on the need to protect America's national security. And Anthony Fauci was there at the beginning, pushing and prodding and supporting this speedy development of vaccinations along. That's the history of it. Look it up yourself. It's kind of this partnership between big government and big pharma. Big pharma doesn't like to do all the research and development into vaccines by itself because it doesn't prove lucrative. So big government came in based on the justification of safety and security, of national security for American citizens, and opened the door for big pharma and its partners in the government to bypass the normal lengthy, costly processes of permitting and approval so that they can speed drugs to the market, supposedly, that will save American citizens. So if you're wondering why this coronavirus crazy continues, even to the point of 2022 now, when we've realized that COVID-19 doesn't impact our youth like we were initially told, and doesn't result in all the deadly statistics that were initially tossed about. Remember when Anthony Fauci talked about millions who would die from this disease, from this virus? The stats that are truthful haven't met the rhetoric, the alarming rhetoric that was offered at the beginning, and yet we're still pretending as if this nation needs to be in lockdown mode and kids need to be kept home from school. And American citizens need to wear 12 face masks and rubber gloves and stay 99 feet away from each other and not go to church and not go to work. So my guest today has some insights into what's going on here and why we continue to harp on things like case counts of the coronavirus, case counts of Delta, case counts of Omicron. Why we continue to harp on those meaningless numbers that do nothing but create states of hysteria that are then exploited by the far left in the political realm for political gain, to steal American citizens' individual liberties, God-given liberties, constitutional liberties. Why are we still doing this? We know now where the emergency use authorization power sprang. But why are we still allowing these bureaucrats in the federal government to use and misuse these emergency use powers? My guest today, Bethany Mandel, she wrote this great piece, this great opinion piece in Deseret News that speaks to this very issue. She's here now to talk about this crazy state that we continue to live under, even though facts say, true science says, we should be back to normal. Bethany, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
So you are a contributing writer for Deseret News. That is one of the hats that you wear. And you had this piece in which you spoke critically about the focus on case counts with the coronavirus, specifically with the Omicron variant. Can you kind of explain to listeners what you wrote about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a piece earlier this week in Deseret News where I basically argued, we have a lot of sort of stress on our healthcare system right now, and we're not really having an honest conversation about what is contributing to that stress. I have a number of friends who are in the medical field, and almost universally they're telling me that the majority of the people that are coming into their offices right now are seeking testing, either for school or to travel, and they're asymptomatic, and they need a document saying that they don't have COVID in order to sort of go about their daily lives. And, we talk a lot, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, about the importance of testing to sort of control the spread. But now that we're 2 years into it with a variant that's extremely transmissible, I think it's time to reevaluate what exactly we're accomplishing with the testing, but more importantly, the cost of the testing. And that cost is a stress on our healthcare system.
Yeah, and it fuels the hysteria. I remember Donald Trump way back when he was still president, and he made the comment that people should stop getting tested, and he was vilified for that. But honestly, he had a common sense point, because I don't understand, I didn't then and I still don't now, why healthy people constantly want to run to get tested.
Yeah, and not just healthy people, but also, there was this sort of a viral tweet from one of these hysterical doctors on Twitter, and they said, one of my coworkers came in the office and he insisted he didn't have COVID, that instead he had stress, and he swabbed himself 3 times and he was sure he didn't have it, so he came to work, but then I made him swab his throat and then he did have COVID. So you always assume you had COVID, and I was confused by the moral of that story, because the moral of the story is, as a doctor especially, don't come to work when you're sick. It doesn't matter what you have. It doesn't matter if you have strep or if you have COVID. If you're sick, stay home. And that has sort of been lost in the messaging about COVID. The fact that that should have been one of the lessons that we learned. If you're sick, stay home. And instead, the lesson became, if you don't have COVID, you can go about your life. But anything else, you're free to go about your business. And, personally, I've had strep and now I've had COVID. I will take COVID over strep. I was vaccinated, so it's a different sort of calculus because my case was less severe, but, no one wants strep throat either.
Yeah, it's very curious. In such a short period of time, we have gone from just the common sense acceptance, so common sense and so accepted that it's unstated, that if you're sick, stay home. We've gone from that to this mass hysteria where we go seeking out sickness to give us reasons to stay home, which in turn just fuels the hysteria. And then the need to stay home becomes this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Ron DeSantis was really sort of vilified for making this sort of common sense statement. But, we've never had this in the history of humanity where people are lining up for an hour and a half in the cold, sometimes several times a week to be tested for anything. If you're sick, stay home. If you're not, go about your business. And that should have been the lesson of the last year and a half, and it wasn't. Instead, it was this myopic focus on only COVID, and as a result, we've seen health outcomes for any number of things really suffer as a result.
Yeah, could you imagine if we had done this all along with the flu? Like every time the flu season rolls around, we have people just running to get tested, and then they can't go to work if they test positive. They have to quarantine. Where would freedom be in that scenario?
Yeah, and not just freedom, but where would, this is not, we're seeing it on the bare supermarket shelves and the canceled flights and everything.
Yes.
You cannot run a society this way. And we really need to evaluate if this is how we're going to be able to move forward in the future, because, airlines are canceling flights, supermarkets can't stock their shelves, the food plants and all different sort of factories, all of these places are suffering staff shortages because of the quarantines. And not to mention the overloaded healthcare system. A lot of that overload is because, first of all, we fired anyone who wouldn't get vaccinated even if they had natural immunity. But this is just, it's not a long-term solution.
Yeah, it's such an insane cycle that we're on right now, because the more that test positive, the more that those that want to exploit the coronavirus for political design, or who are just living in fear, use the case counts of the coronavirus and its various variants to justify more closures, more stay-at-homes, which then brings about more empty store shelves and more staffing shortages. And it's very crazy to watch this from outside this bubble and wonder how and when is it all going to end. What's your guess on this?
I mean, I honestly don't know. I mean, I think that we're also unfortunately seeing a lot of people taking advantage of it so that they can continue to work from home, and they're not sort of realizing the larger implications of, you can't just have every teacher staying at home, because when you have teachers staying at home, then nurses and doctors need to stay home with their kids. This is not how society operates, and we've had an understanding as a society of, the school system is obviously an important educational location, but it also is where kids go during the day while their parents are at work. And, teachers' unions don't seem to understand the implications of keeping the school buildings closed. And, maybe they'll start to realize it when they go to the hospital and there's not enough nurses. And it's not because of COVID. It's because, half the staff have school-aged children and they have to stay home with them.
I'm glad you brought up the larger implications and kind of segue into the schools and children. And I just want to pull out one statement you said about teachers' unions not understanding. That's the best case scenario. Maybe I'm a little bit more cynical, but I actually think that these teacher unions chiefs do understand. They just don't care. They are actually using, and this sounds evil, but it is, they are actually using the children to gain politically.
Yes, I agree. No, I don't think that's cynical. I think that's the reality. If you watch, and I have, if you watch enough of these videos of the school board meetings, we have two possibilities. Either they are completely ignorant and they don't understand what the danger actually is, or they're using it for political gain. And as a parent, which proposition is more appealing? That your teacher, the people who are teaching your children are absolute morons, or they're lazy?
Yeah, either door, they don't belong. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you homeschool. How many kids do you have, and how long have you homeschooled, and how happy are you to be homeschooling during this coronavirus chaos?
Extremely. So this was a pre-existing decision. We homeschooled all throughout. I have 5 children. My older 2 are sort of officially homeschooling. They're in 2nd and 1st grade, and currently finishing up an art activity while we're talking. And it's wonderful. It's funny. Someone sort of dinged me on Twitter today saying, you should send your kids to a real school, and I'm like, why?
I saw that.
What's the benefit to them? And one of the benefits is, to them, that they'll have a more rich social life. And I will disagree with that proposition outside of COVID, but during COVID, it's an absolutely ludicrous assertion that children are having a rich social life while they're masked 8 hours a day and socially distanced and not allowed to talk during lunch. It's dystopian in schools right now, and I'm so glad that we have had built our lives around keeping them home and having a normal social life for them, because they've mostly gone through the last 2 years, not unaffected, but largely unaffected, given, the surroundings that we live in a very, very hysterical, deep blue Montgomery County, Maryland.
One of the things that I really hate to see, and I don't know how you feel about this, but your kids are young, so maybe you haven't put them in face masks or anything, but one of the things I really hate to see are kids walking about in the open, on the playground, away from everybody, but wearing face masks. It just seems like it's setting them up for a life of A, fear, and B, reliance on government to tell them what to do. And going back to what your Twitter critics said, I don't see how that's in the best interest of a child to teach them that in the public schools.
No, absolutely not. There's a lot of, depending on the age, for teenagers, the masks are sort of inhibiting their socialization, and it's having mental health implications. But for young kids, and this is something that, if young primary school teachers were being honest and open, they would be talking about the implications for learning how to read. My my children are in second and first grade, and I don't know where they would be from a literacy perspective if they had been in school with masks, because you only learn the sounds that the letters make by watching someone's mouth. And the number of people that I've heard from who are dealing with kids who have enunciation issues, who have speech delays, everything, it's all related. And we used to, on the American Academy of Pediatrics website, be able to go and look at the importance of seeing faces for babies.
Yeah.
It's how they learn about humanity. It's how they learn emotion. It's how they sort of see the world. If you just sort of put yourself in the position of a 5-month-old baby dropped off at daycare with caregivers who are masked and sometimes in face shields, and you can't see their faces, you can't see their mouths, you don't understand anything that's happening, it must be absolutely terrifying. And all of that is going to have real developmental implications for babies who have been surrounded by caregivers since infancy who were masked. It's going to have speech delays, it's going to have emotional delays, and there's also going to be sort of a more unseen sort of impact on their brain development, because the stress that they're undergoing being surrounded by masked caregivers, I don't think that we can deny that must be more stressful. And all of that stress, those surges of hormones, they imprint on a baby permanently. And so I think that we're going to be seeing, this is going to be a fascinating series of books and PhDs one day about what happened to the brains of babies who were in daycare where their teachers were masked, and what happened to the literacy of children who went through kindergarten, first, second grade, and preschool with teachers that were masked and they were themselves masked. There's so many implications of this that it's unimaginable.
It is. It's horrifying. It's very sad to think about, because you raised some excellent points there. And just speaking from a common sense perspective, well, first off, it's egregious to think that so many in the medical community dismiss what you just so concisely outlined as potential hazards with the masking of children. But second off, it's common sense. You don't even have to have a medical degree to realize that it's difficult to understand people when they're wearing face masks. I'm sure, like me, you and others listening to this have had experiences where you're trying to deal with a customer service representative who is face masked, and you can't hear them, but you can't lip read. So it becomes this standoff of what?
Yeah, and then you get closer to hear them.
Exactly. There goes the social distance.
Right, exactly.
So
yeah, no, it's yesterday Anthony Fauci got on camera to give a speech, and he took his mask off.
Yeah.
Because he had to be understood. He had to be heard. And so I don't understand why we think that Anthony Fauci should be able to take off his mask in order to make himself clearly understood, but a first grade teacher should keep hers on all day, and a first grade child, for that matter. And we are unique in this country. Around the world, they're not masking kids this young, and around the world, they're not masking daycare employees because they understand the developmental implications. So, we don't even have to act like it's common sense, because there are medical bodies and medical professionals in this country, but they're very quiet because they're afraid of being shouted down. But around the world, they have this understanding, and closing schools is a last resort in Ireland, and masking children under the age of 6 is unheard of around the world because of the World Health Organization. We are outliers, and we pretend as though we don't know what might happen if we let a 3-year-old take his cloth mask off. We know, because we can see around the world what's been going on.
Yeah, the science is there for those who want to see it, but honestly, this is too politically rich for some on the left to exploit. And let's just make clear, it's the same air that you're breathing when you enter a school. When you take your face mask off in the lunchroom and eat and put it back on, it's the same air. So if the coronavirus is floating about, you're going to get it when you take your face mask off in the dining room, right?
Yep. And what's really disturbing is that they've now finally come to the common sense realization that cloth masks are useless and they don't do anything. And instead of sort of accepting that, our kids have actually been wearing useless masks for the last 2 years and everyone's been fine, maybe we don't need masks. Instead of coming to that common sense realization, they're pivoting to the other direction, and they're saying all of our kids have to wear medical grade KN95s.
Yep.
And Rochelle Walensky literally a year ago advised against it because it's suffocating to wear that kind of a mask all day long, especially when you have the reduced lung capacity that a child has. And so we're in this crazy position where, vaccines are available to children and adults over the age of 5, and we're faced with a very contagious but relatively mild variant. And our societal response from our elites is not to roll back restrictions, but instead to ramp them up and to put kids in worse and more difficult and suffocating masks instead of just letting them take them off and let them have a normal childhood that we all enjoyed.
Yep, it's a mad world. It really is, and the loons are running. The loons are running things. So, Bethany Mandel, our time's short. If you just want to give a quick mention of where you find optimism in these perilous times.
In my own home, and only in my own home.
Yeah.
It's I'm trying very desperately to give my children a normal life, and I am fighting for that as much as I can in big ways and in small ways, and I urge everyone to do the same. Be a squeaky wheel. When you go to a children's museum and they require your 2-year-old to wear a mask, tell the staff that you don't appreciate it and that it's not acceptable. When they've shut down the touching parts of the museum because of COVID, even though we know that there's no risk of surface transmission of COVID, let the staff know. I mean, we cannot just become autonomons and let this continue. We have to be squeaky wheels, and we have to fight against this, or it's never going to go away.
Yeah, if we keep living the lie that they're forcing on us, then the lie is going to become the reality, and people won't be left to fight it. So thank you, Bethany. Thank you for your insights and for your fight for freedom, and good luck homeschooling. I know there are a lot of parents out there who probably would like to learn more details about how to do this, and so maybe you'll come back on Bold and Blunt and talk about your journey into homeschooling specifically.
It is my favorite thing to talk about, and I would love to do so.
All right. Hey, God bless you. Have a good one.
Thank you.
If you're sick, stay home. If you're not sick, live your life. What a concept. What a long forgotten concept during the last couple years. But that right there is the basic goal that we should have. If you're sick, stay home. If you're not sick, live your life. Let's do what we used to do before the left came in and seized control of the narratives of the coronavirus. Thank you for listening. If you want to subscribe to Bold and Blunt, please do so by going to WashingtonTimes.com or by going to edify.app/podcasts, which is the #1 platform for faith-based podcasts. Tune in next time, and don't forget, as always, in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.